Good evening. My name is Francisco Aragón, and I direct Letras Latinas, the literary initiative at the University of Notre Dame's Institute for Latino Studies. I am coming to you from Bond Hall on the Notre Dame campus. We are gathered this evening to enjoy a sampling of the work of 4 award-winning poets and to discuss current trends in Latinx poetry within the context of the Andrés Montoya Poetry Prize, a long-standing biennial collaboration between the University of Notre Dame Press, who is our host today, and the Institute for Latino Studies at Notre Dame. The prize, which supports the publication of a first book by a Latinx poet residing in the United States, seeks to amplify and celebrate the legacy of its namesake. Andrés Montoya was a Chicano poet from Fresno, California, whose award-winning book, The Ice Worker Sings and Other Poems, has inspired generations. The manuscript that became the book was selected by the late queer Chicano poet Francisco X. Aragón as winner of the Chicano Latino Literary Prize at UC Irvine. It was published in 1999, the year Andrés succumbed to leukemia at the age of 31. The publisher was Bilingual Press. Nearly 20 years later, in 2017, Bilingual Press joined forces with Letras Latinas to co-publish Andrés's posthumous book, A Jury of Trees, which includes a beautiful preface by Andrés's best friend and college roommate, the Chicano writer Daniel Chacon, as well as a critical introduction by Stephanie Feta. The poets we will be hearing from today are the 4 most recent winners of the prize. They will be making their presentations in this order: David Campos, Felicia Zamora, Heidi Andrea Restrepo Rhodes, and Daryl Alejandro Holness. Their Montoya winning volumes were, respectively, Furious Dusk, selected by Rina P. Espaillat, Of Form and Gather, selected by Edwin Torres, The Inheritance of Haunting, selected by Ada Limon, and Step Motherland, selected by John Murillo, with the assistance of screeners Yesenia Montilla and Roberto Carlos Garcia. Step Motherland will make its debut in February of next year. And now I would like to make an announcement about the next edition of the prize. For the first time, we will count on a 2-person jury for the 10th edition of the Andrés Montoya Poetry Prize. They are Alexandra Litton Regalado and Sheila Maldonado. And they will be assisted by co-screeners Ariel Francisco and Adela Najarro. The deadline for the 10th edition of the prize will be March 15th, 2022. Here is how the evening will go. Each of our 4 presenters will share how winning the prize impacted their artistic trajectories. Then they will share with us a current trend in Latinx poetry that excites them. And finally, they will read a piece from their award-winning volume. This will be followed by an organic, free-flowing conversation and a few questions, including questions from you. Please join me in welcoming our first poet, David Campos.
Thank you everyone for joining us. Let me first start by, back in 2007, I took my first poetry class at Fresno City College thinking it was going to be an easy A. I thought nothing much of it. In fact, I treated it like a joke, but I guess the joke was on me. I was inspired by the passion of the instructor, Lee Herrick, and of my classmates. And slowly I turned to that class with joy. It is in that class that I read my first poetry collection, The Ice Worker Sings, and other poems by Andrés Montoya. I looked on the back and I read his bio. I saw his picture. He was like me, from Fresno, Chicano, a big dude. Yes, I'm a big dude, a poet. And I said to myself, if this guy who looks like me can do it, maybe I can too. I looked up the prize it won and found it was defunct, but that's how I came across the Notre Dame Prize. And, foolishly back then, I put together one of my first manuscripts and I sent it off. And I did that for the next 7 years until I won it in 2014. Since then, I would say that really getting into poetry is and thinking about poetry seriously and its form, I began to see all the mistakes that I had made all along the process. But one thing that really has sparked my interest as of late is the way that art, form, and history are intertwining to create these new avenues and new potentials in poetry. Like right now, I'm really interested in that, and more specifically, the book that comes to mind is Anthony Cody's Borderland Apocrypha, a finalist for many national awards, including the National Book Awards. It is one that comes to mind. It experiments with form, language, historical documents, and form, right? Like one of the things that I really loved about it was really seeing the way that sentence structures were being utilized, right? Like one of the things that I did as an English major was diagram sentences and trees, and I was really interested to see how he used that form and pushed it into new directions. And I was really blown away by it, and that's something that really interests me. It's in this larger direction of pushing the form in new directions that really fascinates me. My second book, American Quasar, a collaboration with the artist Marcel Montoya, Andres's little brother, is a baby step in that direction. Just a very baby step in that direction. But I wanted to show you something that I'm currently working on right now, and to kind of give you an idea of where I'm headed with this kind of idea and work and fascination. And this is poetry that looks something like this. It's not something that you're used to seeing, right? So one other thing that really fascinates me currently in my own city is, one, school boundaries, right? And more importantly, something that was recently found in the past like 5 years was a redlining map that existed for the city of Fresno. And so I was looking up the redlining map and issues of segregation here currently and historically in Fresno. And I was starting to create new kind of visual poetics. And this is one of my first stabs at it. But this is something that fascinates me. This is something that really excites me. And I'm seeing this type of work generated by all kinds of Latinx poets across the literary hemisphere, if you will. But I want to read and kind of finish off by reading a poem from Furious Dusk. The Furious Dusk, that was my first step in that direction. And I would consider it my first baby step in experimenting with form. And this is Diet. Visually, it is, ooh, that's rough. Visually, it's like a long poem that's been cut up into 2 different pieces. So if you have the book by any chance, you can follow along on page 44. It's called Diet. I step onto the scale, look at the bathroom mirror fogged with steam, and wait for my weight to flash on the digital display in those rigid lines. My brother reminds me that this is not my first fight. Stretch marks curve down my torso from piss to waistline, off-color stripes of skin tearing. At the doctor's office, I stood on the scale and was asked to step off because I weighed too much. 350 plus, wrote the nurse. The doctor writes, morbidly obese. The hustle of worms waits for me. I have lost before. I tried the Medifast diet and nearly collapsed under its 1,000-calorie restriction. In the kitchen, I would measure 8 ounces of chicken breast and a cup of steamed brown rice for dinner. I ordered pizza on the 22nd day. Before I married, I lost 20 pounds and gained it back and more. This body climbs and falls on the rails I build, but the scale is not the one that will buckle underneath the stress. I can't run because of a bad knee. I show up early on the first day of class to pick a desk I won't get stuck in. I check the width between the chair and the writing surface. I see the blur of this body in the mirror, a glimpse of my phantom as 303 appears on the display. This is not my first fight. The stretched skin wrinkles without the fat, and my pants don't fit. I grab a knife and ruler to measure the next hole on my belt. I drive the knife through the leather. Thank you. And please join me in welcoming Felicia Zamora.
Thank you, David. Actually, I'm so glad you read that piece. That's one of my favorites from you, and the many favorites. Hello, everyone. Welcome to our panel tonight. Thank you so much for spending time in poetry and specifically Latinx poetry. I'm very excited to be here, especially with these amazing artists, but also just sort of talking about what the prize has meant to me. The Andrea Montoya Prize for me was a huge awakening and a huge opening, not just to a published book, but actually to a larger community in which was something that I was missing very much so. You know, I always think of myself as not being born into poetry or to the arts. You know, I was from a very low socioeconomic class in this country, where I grew up in a motel with my brother, sister, and my mom. And, you know, we lived in one of those like 1950s diners that were attached to a motel. And so we had a living room, 1 bedroom, a kitchen, a bathroom, like all in one space. And art was never really thought of as a trajectory for, you know, young brown kids, at least not for me. So even though I wasn't born into poetry, I really do think that poetry was born into me first without me fully understanding that. And my existence in art, you know, I resisted being an artist for a really long time, because how would I provide for me? How would I provide for my family? You know, I was working in the fields when I was 8 years old, lying and saying I was 12, getting paid under the table. And as I grew, I realized that I couldn't continue to push away that which was calling inside me, the idea of creating, and the idea of creating with words, and especially words in English, where I'm actually estranged to Spanish as a language, and multiple reasons why my mom stopped speaking in the household. And I still fell in love with the idea of the power of words. And what I found, though, is as I began to create, my physical history in art became siloed. I really found myself and my voice when I was living in Colorado, and there weren't a lot of Latinx poets that I knew. There weren't any mentors, and I felt like I was always groping for ways to have my internal become external. And when I found out that I had won the Andrea Montoya Prize, the publication of this book and being part of the legacy became so very important to me. it gave me a community that I so desperately needed. And the world expanded for me and continued to expand. It continues to expand this day because you don't forget your first book. The first book is so important. And even though the award was given in 2016, the book published in 2017, the reality is, though, this was my fourth manuscript I had written. And so it wasn't as if I was waiting for anything. I kept writing and writing and hoping that I would get seen, or that my work would get seen, and there would be value in it. And so I am unbelievably thankful for the community that this has given me, and the communities that I am now a part of. My career trajectory would not have been possible without the first book of poems coming out, and has also led to the books that I have now as well. I do want to mention the things that I'm excited about specifically in contemporary Latinx poetry right now is that it seems like, to me, from what I am reading, that the Latinx communities, we are convexing and really resisting all the fallacies around the historical dominant narrative that have been pressed upon us about what our art is or what our art should look like. You know, for me, each poet in their own ideations of their identity in and around their Latinx identity we're carving new lenses and trajectories in thinking. These imaginative futures with our own voices through our own voices. We are now the ones who are getting to define ourselves. You know, recently my second book was part of four poets who were reviewed by Leslie Sains on awe. And Sains wrote, in a predominantly white publishing landscape, hell-bent on pigeonholing BIPOC writers and solely writing work that confirms their racist implicit biases, it was inspiring to see a fellow female Latinx poet dare to believe her language has value beyond discussions of identity, inequity, and immigration. In this way, And an Open Marvel stands as a powerful testimony to what Carl Phillips deemed a politics of mere being. You know, and Sain's words really, really inspire me because it's we're seeing each other, we're being seen in the many facets and trajectories of the way that our writing can and should come into the world. You know, our art holds value in a trillion different ways, and we get to define what those ways look like right now. We are on the precipice of something extremely great in Latinx literature. You know, if I want to write about awe, and I would say that And an Open Marvel is very much about awe. If I want to write about awe and consciousness, I'm gonna write about awe and consciousness, damn it. You know, poets like Raquel Salas Rivera are using self-translation as, and I quote, a mode of self-knowledge to resist illegibility. Ricardo Maldonado's book, The Life Assignment, also works toward this self-knowing. David brought up Anthony Cody, but like Anthony Cody's work, Vanessa Angelica Villarreal's work, they explode forms on the page and the public and private conversations around docupoetics toward this futurism of poetry for Latinx individuals. And we continue to see new books coming on the scene by new Latinx writers, Sarah Lupita Olivares, Joshua Escobar, Julian Randall, Sarah Borjas, and Benjamin Garcia, just to name a few, who are making space for new trajectories. And we are not just changing the narrative, we actually are the new narrative, which is extremely exciting. So the piece that I'm going to read tonight from Of Form and Gather is one of my favorite pieces. And I know you're not supposed to say that as a poet, you're not supposed to love your art that way, but I do. And this one is very much about awe. Decoy. I am the ocean bottom. My craters full of bioluminescence, twinkling in heavy, heavy dark. Who speaks of the float circling inside them? Cut open a creature. What do you expect? A line of labels and a thing exposed? Think, clever me, let's dissect, let's slice an eel, pare down parts, see how we mean. Now you, eel under knife. Now me. Hold the blade away from anything that tears. Call the power of light, of adaptation. the fish in heavy wet with a glowing lure on its head. That's something. Do you need to collect all parts to be something? When first you swim, remember flesh, amniotic everything. You, on the other hand, ignore the innate sense of fluidity. When I say you, I mean I. A little I thou never hurt as long as you fasten others' oxygen masks first. I am a giant tube worm, plume scarlet. Think hemoglobin. Think what carries in presence of sulfide. Think insides I wear out, and you consider float. The decoy made of bob and shine and teeth and fins and. Thank you. Our next poet up is going to be Haiti Andrea Restrepo Rhodes.
Thank you, Felicia. Hi, everybody. Thank you for being here and for just taking time to have these conversations. It feels, I don't think I've ever been in quite a space like this, just focusing specifically on this theme of Latinx poetry. And it feels really important to just reflect together on what it is and where it's been and where we're going with it. My experience with the Andrés Montoya Prize was life-changing, has been life-changing, and it was amazing to work. It has been amazing to work with Francisco and with the University of Notre Dame Press. Like Felicia said, the first book it's a huge moment, I think, for any poet. And I think for me, part of what it did, what it transformed for me, or why it was a turning point, is that there's so much messaging in the world around how much space we're supposed to take up or not, because of gender, because of race, because of any number of things. And I think that winning this prize and going through the process of bringing this book into the world was a moment when I started to give myself a different kind of permission to take up that space and to connect with people through taking up that space and encouraging others to take up that space with their stories, with their voices. So that's been felt really important. And then just the people that I've connected with through the opportunities that have opened up through winning the prize, whether it's doing readings at universities and connecting with students, some of whom had never met a living poet before. And there's something about that moment that always invites me to be and become the person that I would have wanted to encounter at that age. I've gotten to collaborate with people in different parts of the world. I'll never forget receiving a message from a young queer poet in Malaysia who was having some kind of underground poetry reading circle. Homosexuality is criminalized and outlawed in Malaysia. And so to connect with somebody living that life, to talk about queer poetry and post-colonial poetry, was really incredible. Yeah, just the people that I've connected with and to share space together with others, where poetry really feels like a world building possibility and process of being together, and feels like a really vital cultural and political kind of work. As far as what I'm excited about in Latinx poetry right now, I partly just want to ask what we all mean when we even say Latinx, because Latinidad is a hotly debated and contested term at the moment. And maybe we can talk about that later as we talk about Latinx poetry. I've spent the last week playing with different definitions, and I always come up against different walls because as a dear friend of mine expressed yesterday, I think it's an irregular formation that must kind of stay irregular as part of the politics of what we're doing. And what that means for Latinx poetry, I think what I want to say is really similar to what Felicia shared, but one of the things I've noticed in the last several years is how much the scope of Latinx poetry has expanded, how diverse our stories and lives and writing are. And it feels like because of our growing presence in the literary world and in the arts, as well as the work that generations before us have done to carve out room for us to insist on the necessity of our writing and art and voices, it just feels like there's more breathing space for Latinx to mean so many things, and we're not as trapped as we once were by dominant white conceptions within the literary world and outside of it about how we either need to assimilate or perform our Latinidad. So I think there's just a kind of vastness about it that I'm seeing in the kinds of Latinx poetry that are being published. And I was also thinking about Carl Phillips' essay, A Politics of Mere Being, as this beautiful articulation of that pressure to perform a particular kind of identity as always already politicized in relation to the grip of colonial capitalist power. So what it means to write, to not always be writing about the violence that we face or about what it means to survive living in this country, but to allow ourselves something like awe, or to write about flowers or the quiet morning joys of staying in bed with a lover, that is always in some way political, but isn't necessarily performing what's expected of us based on a kind of identitarian notion of what our politics have to be. So that feels really important to me, and I think is shaping how I'm relating to poetry's potential as resistance. I want to share this piece. I think for me, part of what feels really central to my work is always playing with the tension between the vast oppressiveness of the world that we're in and the always present possibilities for resistance that we find in the cracks and in the quiet places and in the moments of the brutal horrors that are ongoing. This is called Onomasticon, or I Sing the Names of Our Dead. Whenever I sing, there are generations in my throat reaching out with the long arms of our old and tattered histories. When I sing, my grief rises like acid in my throat, cutting my tongue, coating my teeth in red, in the fingerprints of a tired hope scratching at the broken door, long rusted at the hinges, still scratching. I sing these fevered words that fly, these eidetic prophecies, a tomorrow once written in the palm, lashed in the palm, broken in the palm. I sing the names of our dead and umber you. I mount your names on the wall of my mouth, keep the monument warm, and nobody's name will be forgotten, and nobody's dream will fall unseen, for when I sing tree and boughs will sullen bend with the weight of you, nodding amorse sorrow. When I sing pájaro, pájaro, and murmurations burrow the blue, every wing a messenger, a thunderous feathered conjuring. When I sing star, and your brilliance lights up my mouth, illuminates the plains of this weary and bellowing night. I sing rose and you bloom thorned to scratch your name in the soil. I sing rise and the moon climbs over mountains, revealing the road of your arms. I sing march and the earth will tremble out, a eulogy, a prayer, a promise. I sing how and why and when, and your name will wind my palm into a fist and I will hold it high. I sing sky and we will think of freedom. We will taste it. We will taste it in our mouths and it will be your name, all your names, every name of you, they think, be gone and done. That's from The Inheritance of Haunting. I was supposed to show that. Thank you so much. And I will turn things over to Daryl Alejandro Holness.
Thank you, Heidi, and thank you, everyone. This is such a wonderful event to be a part of, and thank you to Francisco Aragón, especially for spearheading it. You know, the Andrés Montoya Poetry Prize, I just won it. And what it means to me is still coming together, and I'm sure it will grow in its significance for me as the years go by. And it's very inspiring to hear what it's meant to all of the past winners that are at the event tonight. You know, so far for me, this award really means community, and community means sustenance. As a college professor, I'm incredibly sustained by my students and those relationships. And I think of them as part of my community. And I'm excited that my community now also includes so many poets that are at this event and the many more poets that are to come who will be winners of the prize and finalists of the prize. I hope that this prize continues to shine a light on the diversity that exists within the community, and that it resists the dangers of a single story representing Latinidad. I think this prize highlights how, as a community, we are varied, complex, and evolving. And I want to take a moment and also name a few incredible poets whose work I've been watching and continue to inspire me, who are Afro-Latinx or Black Latinx poets, including Julian Randall, Janice Miller, and John Murillo, who selected my book for this prize. And I want to send a shout out to them for a moment, because you know, when Francisco proposed this question of you know, what is something that we're passionate about in Latinx poetry right now, I immediately turned to these poets and looked at their work and saw a few commonalities and some of the themes around identity, around Blackness in Latin America. But also I saw music, and that really excited me because my entry into poetry was music. I started out as a musician, and you know, my big brother is in the music industry, and my first poems were lyrics that I was writing because I was hoping that they could turn into a song. But a part of me was always more interested in building meaning in ways that could become increasingly complex on the page. And I decided to study poetry as a way to really perfect my craft and to really strengthen my ability as a writer. And I'm excited to see how, you know, these writers incorporate music into their work, and it continues to inspire me to incorporate music into mine. So I'm going to hold up his book here. Julian Randall references Kendrick Lamar and Frank Ocean, and Janice Miller, who's a Panamanian American poet just like me. She references musicians like Willie Colon. And John Murillo, in his award-winning collection Contemporary American Poetry with a K, references musicians like Marvin Gaye. And a lot of poems in John's earlier book, Up Jump the Boogie, reference you know, many different hip hop artists. And I pose as a question, if you're at home or at school and you're watching this, I want you to think about, what was your entry point into poetry? A lot of folks accessed poetry through other means, right? I have a lot of friends who are spoken word poets, and that journey for them actually started in theater because they were interested in performing. They started performing monologues, and then a professor or a peer, invited them to perform a monologue at a poetry slam, and they found a poem to perform, right, in that context. And so there are all of these different ways that we enter the poem. And for me, it's through music. It's through music and popular culture, and sometimes even technology. And that all comes together in the poem that I've chosen to read for you tonight, Rihanna and Child. And I'm going to briefly also send a shout out to Rigoberto Gonzalez, because I wrote this poem after a conversation with him where I, true to the millennial I am, I said, Rihanna was a legend. And I think she might have had maybe 2 or 3 albums out by then. She was a legend. She was an icon. And she is diva extraordinaire. And, he said to me, prove it in a poem. And I wrote a couple different poems, but settled on this one, Rihanna and Child, and polished it and worked on it, and it ended up in my book. And I'm so excited to share it with you today. For inspiration, I was looking at photos of Rihanna on Instagram, and I found this photo of her holding a baby. And it reminded me so much of portraits of mother and child that you find especially in the Renaissance era. And I wrote this poem thinking about her music, thinking about Anne Sexton, thinking about mothers and children, and my mom, of course, as well. Rihanna and Child. The rude girl is with Child in the Instagram pic. It's not her baby. She wears a costume that conservatives may describe as exotic and revealing. I call her mi pana, I call her mi pai. The baby pulls sequins off her bustier. But she's not afraid she won't shine. I was raised by her kind. She shows us how to celebrate carnival as a hashtag bad girl goddess, tantalizingly hashtag wifey material, playing a benevolent stepmother with hashtag MILF appeal, taking a break from dancing to hush a child in her auntie's laundry room. Over 500,000 followers like this portrait of Rihanna as the Black Madonna. In it, her voluminous hair is a halo. Her dazzling headdress is a crown. A beaded curtain frames her as a domestic deity with a washing machine for a throne. Her breast sits ready to be clutched for comfort by the bawling majesty in her arms. Over 500,000 followers hail woman for nestling babe against her bejeweled bustier. Millions more were raised by her kind. Millions more once nestled on the chest of a mother's uniform or on the costume of an auntie close enough to be a stepmom, taking care of others on break from dancing soca or murga in the parade. I was raised by her kind, dazzling and Amazonian, running so fast through the hairspray that her wig almost bursts into flames. She who fills beach dunes with matches, feathers, rhythms, and milk bottles. Her nude arms waving at parade people walking by, her ribs cracking where the DJ drops the beat. She is not afraid to die. Yes, I was raised by women like that. I was raised by her kind. Thank you. I would like to introduce our host for the evening, Francisco Aragón.
Thank you, Daryl. That concludes the first part of our program. Now I want to invite our poets to join us to start our conversation. And I think there's a number of ways we can go this way. I can pose a question, or if there's a question that any of you have that want to pose to the group, we can go that route as well. Or we can begin by asking people in the audience if they want to pose a question first. Does anyone have a burning question they want to ask first? Or if not, I can start us off. Okay. This question may not apply to Daryl because Daryl's our brand new winner, but I know that a number of you, it's been a few years since you won your prize. I think David in his question addressed this question a little bit. And the question is, how have you seen your work evolve since winning the prize? Who would like to share with our audience those insights?
I guess I'll go first since it's been like the longest.
Okay.
Right? I think seeing the winners that have come after and reading their books has really inspired me to be more experimental and really push beyond my comfort zone. Right? Even American Quasar for me was just like, okay, I need to be okay with this collaboration and the conversation that is happening and let it organically form into something that I may be uncomfortable with. And then reading their work, reading everybody else's work along the way, I began to see, what I can do. And so what I shared in that like brief PDF, right, was something that is kind of scary for me to share because it's so new and it's kind of wild and it's still kind of raw, but that's where it's pushed me from, right? That's where I'm headed. So it's not like, your typical free verse, a line to the left, in really neat and clean stanzas. It's something artistic, something beyond what one would expect.
I guess in the lineage of things, I'm next with like David, the old folks. No. Well, as I mentioned, like without this book, without the first book, like there isn't a gateway into sort of the poetic existence that I had really been wanting. And that includes, Daryl, thanks again so much for bringing up community, right? Because I was direly in a drought of community and wasn't quite sure how to find it. And the Andrea Montoya Prize, Letras Latinas, Canto Mundo, like there's so many things have now led me to be part of the communities that I have always wanted. And in finding community, there is a confidence about our art. There is a confidence in the way that we move through the art. Now there are still things that happened, technically in a form and gather that I still love. I am still obsessed with the semicolon. I could write an entire book about the semicolon and the M dash and prose poetry and prose-ish poetry, and how our form acts as a container in which to hold the weight of the difficult topics that we're trying to bring into the world of the page, right? Those are all still there, but I think I have taken a greater risk to put authorial presence, my own history, my family, that which has ached me as a child and still into adulthood onto the page. And in some ways, I have been completely opposite of most these wonderful risk-taking poets of right now. Like there is so much being said, so much that is hard, but it's hard to get to the joy and to the hope and to the reclamation of self that's actually happening. And so it's like the trauma doesn't define us. It's how we take the trauma and we build from it and we understand it and we learn to set it aside so it doesn't run our existence. And I mean, it took me 40 some years before I wrote my first poem about my father. And there are artists who've been doing that from the moment they put pen to paper, our fingers to keyboard. And wow, I celebrate that. I celebrate it so much. You know, I started with the cellular. I started with that which connects us in the interior to exterior of being a natural being in a natural world. And I'm still obsessed with all of that. But now consciousness and saying what needs to be said and speaking about me and my body and the space in which I inhabit and being okay with inhabiting space is really where pieces have gone now. And so I kind of did completely opposite of what most people do. And I don't know, I guess that was my trajectory. And I'm proud of that. I'm proud of the risks I'm taking because I had a book published, and now, you know, number 6 is coming out in spring. It's like, we don't wait. We don't wait for the readers. We don't wait for what we think the book's going to be. We let the art do its thing, and we trust that. And that for me is the exciting part.
Part of what I wanted to say in response to this question is that the experience of being in this particular community by way of winning the Montoya Prize has asked of me to dive deeper into Andrés Montoya's work itself. And I think encountering the Ice Worker Sings, thinking of it as a piece of, as a collection that is addressing environmental racism and the impacts of capitalism and racism on health and body and life, life chances, and thinking about Andres's own experience has really given me a different kind of permission to write about those themes in my own life related to my own chronic illness. And that's been really powerful, to be in conversation with him and to invite that kind of haunting from him and his work. The other piece is that not having an MFA, for me, poetry writing has always been a very intuitive process, and I feel very not schooled in things craft related and just like the sort of foundational basics of like poetry's rules and forms. And so I think with the process of this book, this first book coming into the world in the last couple of years, it's asked of me to like learn a lot of those foundations in the writing of poetry, to learn what the rules even are so that I can think about breaking them more consciously. I've been experimenting with sonnets in the last year and really just trying to study the sonnet to think about what we can do with that form to twist it and alter it and mold it to our use. And I'm thinking a lot about poetry as critical inquiry and as study itself. And so that's something that's really present for me and is a kind of different direction that my work has gone.
Carol?
Well, I would say, you know, I think Felicia said something about permission. And since winning the prize, I've been giving myself permission to really explore all sorts of topics. It's interesting what you said, Felicia, about not writing about your father until you were, I don't know, 40 years into your life. When I first started studying poetry at the collegiate level, so many folks would say, oh, you're Black from the Caribbean writing about your homeland. You're just like Derek Walcott. You're just like so. And they would make all of these comparisons. And I remember, you know, I sort of have always been this rebellious teenager. And I was rebelling against being a lawyer by being a poet. And then when someone tried to put me in a box as a poet, I was like, well, I'm not going to be those things. I'm not going to write about those things. And it did take me some time before I gave myself permission to write about my homeland and to write about where I'm from and what my journey to and through this country has been, because I had to also trust that I would do it in a way that was uniquely me. And I needed to figure out I needed to find my voice. I need to really figure it out. And now that I have, and now that this book is out and I'm so excited to share it with the world, thanks to the prize, I'm giving myself permission to explore other topics now. Now that I have this voice, I'm looking to my second book. I'm looking to, Felicia says she's releasing her 6th book. I don't know if you saw on the camera, but my eyes went like, I was like, I can't even imagine what it's like to be there, but I'm looking forward to one day, hopefully that being my reality too. And I'm just so excited about the journey that this has set me on. And I'm looking at each one of you here on the call today as a kind of future, and I hope that anyone who's watching right now that is, working on that manuscript and it's there in the drawer, that hopefully this encourages them to submit.
Thank you, Daryl. Before we open it up to the audience, do any of you have questions that you want to pose your co-panelists?
I would maybe ask you all, because we're talking about kind of finding voice and how important voice is. And, Daryl, bringing up this, our raw, unadulterated voice of who we are and what we as individuals have to offer the conversation is so very important, because we shouldn't be shaping to what we think is contemporary poetry right now. We need to be really looking inward to be like, what is coming and echoing from the inside out? And I guess the question I have is, in your current projects, all 3 of you, what has surprised you? Has anything you've created kind of been a moment where you look at it and you're like, I can't even believe I created this. I either love it or it's terrifying me, or something about it has surprised you in a way that you wouldn't have thought possible?
Great question.
I guess while you're thinking, I'll give you an example like of what I was thinking of is Haiti, you were talking about exploring the sonnet. Well, I recently wrote a crown of sonnets for my newest manuscript. And I'd never written a crown of sonnets. Like, I'm like, okay, let's do this. And it took on its own body, its like own orbit. And it actually dug up some really difficult memories that I had hidden deep down and never told anyone. And so I really started to explore this like trajectory of secrets, of like, why do we keep a secret? Or like, what does it mean that I kept a secret that was so painful to myself for, 37 years? Like, what does that actually mean to me in my trajectory? And so I guess I have, like, when I try new things and I push myself and the limits that I put into the art, some really outstanding things come forward, both in my thinking and my research.
I'll jump in and try. So that one piece I shared, right? That's scary. I don't know if people really will understand a lot of the research. Like, one of the things that has really pushed me into new avenues is research. I've been very kind of like tentative about including heavy amounts of research and how much I should give context of. And so to a certain point, I'm like, I don't care, right? I'm just going to create something that looks cool to me, right? And if folks love what I think is cool, then great. If not, then, I guess I'll suffer the the rejection of the slush pile as it comes back to me, and I start working on finding a new voice in that way. And I think that's the scariest part is, yeah, sure, I have somewhat found my voice in these two books, but now since I'm doing something so radical, I need to find what my voice sounds in that space and how it is going to mold in that space. And that's kind of interesting and new, and I've yet to really find that for myself.
I love that, David. Thank you.
It's such a good question, Felicia, and I feel like it's a really hard one, but the first thing that's coming to mind for me is that in trying to work with form, I find myself coming up against what feels like failure in a different way than when there's no form containing what a piece is supposed to become. And that's just been really interesting to like in learning how to be within form and to play with it and alter it, to also let myself write pieces that actually feel like really bad poetry. And to know that that's like a part of the process of learning how to engage with new kinds of writing. And it's interesting, this question of voice, because I think writing within form, for me, I feel like it takes away my voice because of the structure, and I'm trying to learn how to be in my voice within that structure. And that's just been an interesting experiment.
I actually really love that idea of how do we bodily, physically consider ourselves within the art when the art is so disattached from that which is the bodily. But actually it's not, because the act of creation, has both the physicality to it and also the consciousness and mentality to it. But I love.
Yeah, I would say that for me, I wrote this poem called Black Parade, and the book had already been finished. It might have already won the prize. I believe so, because I wrote this poem during the pandemic, and I had just finished writing this play that was produced at National Black Theater here in New York City. And it closed because of the pandemic. And the play was about this man named Bayano who was brought on a slave ship to Panama, and fought for his freedom, and then fought to free over 1,000 different Africans in Panama during a 20-year period. And there's a lot of African spirituality that's also in this play. And I wrote Black Parade one day because I wanted to submit it for poem. I wanted to submit a poem for Poem a Day. And I was like, okay, I've got to sit down and figure this out so I can submit something. And this poem about that is about moving to New York and the AIDS crisis, and I have a grand uncle that came to New York and was never heard of again, and thinking about parades, and which are a lot of the carnival tradition of parade in a lot of Latin American countries in the Caribbean is tied to African spiritual marches, and the elaborate costumes and et cetera are all ways of embodying the ancestors. And this poem just kind of like came out of nowhere. And it was still related to the topics of my book. So I ended up including it in the book, and it was published on the Poem a Day website. But it just surprised me because for many years, I had been committed to writing poems, in the nature of this manuscript that were very kind of like focused in a certain way about my particular journey from Panama to the United States. And then this whole other poem about like ancestors and like Egungun spirits and HIV and New York City in the 80s and just all this other stuff just kind of like appeared. And I was just excited about, the potential for your work in one place to be able to bleed over into your poems, even in moments that you don't expect it to. And, you know, briefly, Haiti mentioned hearing from a poet in Malaysia where homosexuality is criminalized. And the poem a day had such a wide reach that I ended up hearing from folks all over the country. They were still mostly in the US, but you know, they were particularly moved by the queer elements that were also in the play, in the poem. And it's just incredible how, you know, something that felt like it really came from the muses ended up reaching, you know, folks that otherwise would have never even read my work. So it was just one of those moments.
That is so awesome. And yeah, that poem was amazing. I remember seeing it. I don't know, you know, once we're all part of this community now, and we see each other's work, and it's like we celebrate, even if we hadn't formally met before.
Thank you, Deirdre.
Absolutely.
We have some wiggle room to go a few minutes over the hour. I'd like to ask our audience if there is a question for our panelists, and we'll wind down with that. You could type it in the chat room if you want. Don't be shy. Here we go. What is a topic that you're all excited to write about in the future? And this question is from Maricel Moreno, my colleague here at Notre Dame. What is a topic that you're all excited to write about in the future? Anyone want to jump in?
I'll briefly say that for me, it's health and wellness and self-care. And, you know, my mother's a nurse, and there's this long tradition of women in healing roles in my family. And this past year with the pandemic, it's really made me think more about what does it mean to provide healing resources for your community? You know, what does it mean to really prioritize your health as opposed to productivity, you know, in the way that we live our lives? And that's just such a topic that is on my mind so constantly that I'm sure that it's going to show up in my writing soon.
Thank you, Daryl. Anyone else?
Vanessa Angelica Villarreal, I had was in conversation with her for a new series that I created through my research at the University of Cincinnati, which is Poetry as Activism, and as poetry as a catalyst for liberation and radicalization for BIPOC and marginalized people. And so that's actually getting launched, and she turned me on to Zakiya Iman Jackson's work, and talking a lot about how non-representability, which Blackness has non-representability, and how, you know, we are no longer, as Brown and Black individuals, sort of seeking the humanist prize anymore. Instead, we are redefining who we are based on a non-white and oppressive view of what human is. And these intersections of the public and the private, and the cognitive of our thinking, and how we got to the hierarchical thinking that we're at, and trying to undo that sphere is a really big interest of mine.
Thank you, Felicia. Haiti, David?
Kind of connected to that anti-humanist project. I've begun to dive into quantum physics and astrophysics, to read about it, to think about it, to write about it as a way to differently articulate our being in the world and in relation to each other. So that's, you know, newer work that's happening and that I'm working toward.
David?
sorry, for some reason I got disconnected very quickly, but I'm glad that I'm back. But something that I'm currently interested in is current issues of segregation in public schools. I've been doing a lot of local history, figuring and finding out, how aligned or misaligned some of the redlining maps and their school boundary maps, how they overlap, what are those issues, and really digging into the local newspaper archives. That's been a lot of fun, and seeing what I can do with that kind of work, including the National Archives, which has some really great and interesting jury trials or just trials in general, which you could just pull all kinds of work from. It's really fun.
Thank you all. I'm going to wind our session down by completing and articulating our community. And that is to say that I want to say the first winner of the prize was Cheryl Luna, and she was selected by Robert Vasquez, poet from Fresno. Second winner was Gabe Gomez, and he was selected by Valerie Martinez. Our third winner was Paul Martinez Pompa, and he was selected by Martin Espada. Our fourth winner was Emma Treyes. She was selected by Silvia Curvelo. And our fifth winner was Lori Ann Guerrero, and she was selected by the poet who selected Andrés Montoya's book back in 1997, and that is the late Francisco X. Alarcón. Thank you all for joining us. Good luck, good night, stay safe.
Thanks, everyone.